to the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streifeld Hall, Director of Policy and Research at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today I'm joined by Hala Al-Karib, an African feminist, activist, and essayist who is the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, which is also known as the SIHA Network. Thank you for joining us today, Hala.
Thank you for having me.
Hala, can you give us a bit of background on how your organization was founded and the work that you do for women and girls in the Horn and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda more broadly?
Absolutely. So SIHA was founded by a group of women activists and peace activists at a very critical moment, in the history of the Horn. Well, it seemed that, the Horn of Africa history, it's all very, very critical. When we compare what was happening during the mid-1990s when SIHA was founded, it was Somalia war, it was the Eritrean liberation, and it was the Ethiopian new regime taking over, and Eritrea has becoming a state. Also, it was the war between South Sudan and North Sudan, and it was kind of moving towards its ending. And so there was a wide sense of optimism that this region at some point is going to witness stability. So a group of women from across the region, they came together and they have decided that they don't feel quite fitting in, within the Eastern Africa or Northern Africa. And they felt that the Horn of Africa women has a specific identity, the extensive hybridity, the geopolitical position between Eastern Africa, Northern Africa, and then across from the Arab Peninsula and so on. So they formed SIHA Network, which was founded basically on the principle of challenging all forms of violence against women and girls across the Greater Horn of Africa. And this is how we were found. It was an initiative that was driven by feminists, and they didn't have any resources, and they decided to make it a network where or an umbrella an institution that would include all the grassroots that works on women agenda across the region. And they managed to have their first conference at the time in Nairobi, Kenya. Then they moved to the Secretariat Office of the Network to Hargeisa, which it was at that point in time, it was the end of the Somalia war. But then again, it was difficult, so they relocated to Djibouti. And then finally, in the early 2000s, the Ahfad University for Women has offered SIHA a home at the university premises. And this is where I found SIHA. Was about 2004, 2005. At that point in time, it was, the Sudan Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and then but at the same time, another devastating conflict has started in Darfur. So, we were a classroom inside Ahfad University. We had 3 staff. So right now we are more than 75 staff across the region. And, despite all the wars and the conflicts and everything, we have our offices in all the region's countries on ground.
As we mark 25 years since UN Security Council Resolution 1325, what stands out to you as the most significant achievement of the WPS agenda? And where do you feel the agenda has fallen short, especially in conflict zones like Sudan or across the Horn of Africa?
First of all, it's important to acknowledge the efforts of um, adopting the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That's a collective effort, and it's an amazing effort that gives all of us the legitimacy and the inspiration to continue to do what we are doing. So that's really very, very important. But it's also, as the years goes on, it's quite obvious that having a broad agenda is not enough. You know that we need to invest more on on shifting attitudes, on shifting behaviors, and be quite genuine and sincere about issues of awareness, about peace culture, about especially for us as women, about issues that matters, justice and accountability on crimes that was committed against women. That's really very, very important, for the stability of the region, and the grievances being inherited from one generations to the others. And, it's this region has been through, I don't know how many peace agreements, but I think it's like the region with a massive number of peace agreements. If you look alone at Sudan, South Sudan, or Somalia, or even Ethiopia, the number of peace agreements, but it's peace agreements that, just, on papers. But, the concept of peace itself, it's not being challenged or defined. And I think also the fact that most of those peace agreements, they didn't have mechanisms, safeguarding mechanisms that can protect the agenda of the women and girls and their positions in the political process. So, so it's, there is a lot of good things and serious attempts, but I think we have to be very open as well, for self-criticism as we are moving forward.
Yeah, I think you started to touch on this with talking about the history and the women who have been at the forefront. But how have grassroots women's networks in your region shaped or reshaped the WPS framework over the years?
I think the women have done what they can. I think the women have sustained the movements, and they kept it alive under the most difficult circumstances. And what's really painful is that this is not being acknowledged or seen or recognized sufficiently. um, I think, the women has constantly in the region been making life and death decisions on behalf of their communities, and they were the one and are the one who are collecting the pieces after each conflict and every war. And they are the one who are keeping communities alive and maintaining, the intercommunal peace despite all the violence around them. But I think, doing that, they have not been sufficiently acknowledged or supported, and their efforts has often minimized. And so that kind of, positioned us as women somewhere in the middle, so just receiving minimal support, minimal acknowledgements. And we are trying as much as possible, to do what we can, but against a very, very hostile and difficult environment. Um, so I strongly believe that any form of life, that's currently happening, and peace in the region, it's definitely because of the women effort, despite the very grim picture. But they are acting against extremely hostile environment. And I'm speaking particularly about women leaders, women grassroots leaders who are at the front line. Um, you know, um, so they are trying their best, but often not being seen. They are off the communication radar. They are off the information, radar. Information is not shared with them. They are the level of investment on them, as I said, is very minimal. Um, they were remembered always last minute, and just as an accessories, to any process. But and they were not taken seriously, and this is one of the reasons that the WBS agenda continue to struggle. If you are not taking, the actors who are carrying the burden of the WBS seriously, then the agenda will never, take its position within society.
On the topic of the adversity that you're facing while also, being central to defending rights. I know that SIHA and other organizations are facing increasing backlash that threaten your vital work to end violence against women and girls. What form of targeting or restrictions do you face in Sudan and in the Horn? And how is it affecting your ability to do your work?
Well, there is definitely, we're aware that we are working in a hostile environment. I'll tell you, the expectations of WBS activists and women rights defenders and women at the front line is to act as as a choir, at the background, not at the main actors. You can't perform with your own voice, so you have to echo the voices of the different political voices. So you can't, as a feminist also network, as a feminist institution, we cannot afford doing that. But that does not sit well. The expectation that we have to cheer for the political actors, we have to to pick sides and things like that, but not to act independently on behalf of the women and girls and their different voices and agencies. So that's in itself, it kind of it triggers a lot of hostility, because what's expected from women is to act as cheer, to clap, to dance, but not to be the main candidate, and to have a voice of their own. So resenting that role definitely has a price, and it generates risks. But then also, when you expose perpetrators, when you talk about violence, when you talk about women suffering and who's actually causing that, the perpetrators, in a society that they think that the conversations about sexual violence, about rape, about women being enforced disappear, abducted, or violated, that has to be, they expect that should not be talked about. So when they see people like us who are very vocal about it, who are trying to really make sure that everybody knows, and that this conversation is not, not to be concealed, and that the victims have a voice, and women are not sidelined. Of course, we experience also significant hostilities and threats. So we are experiencing layers and layers. Also, those who are not standing with us on the same, principles. We speak about liberations of women, we speaks about the diversity, and the gender identities and all those things. For them, we are evil. So we have so many enemies, I have to say, as feminists in this environment. But at the same time, we have plenty of allies. And this is what keeps us alive, and what gives us the energy to continue working, that we have support, we have solidarity, we have commitments from women at the grassroots level, appreciation. And does not happen for free. It happens because we are committed as well. More than 60% of our funds goes to sub-grants and small grants. She has provided significant support to grassroots women groups and women at the front lines. We give grants based on the fund that we have. We can give a grant for $200. We give individual grants, we give organizations grants, we give institution grants, we support women organizations to exist, because we believe that the ecosystem, we all have to be present. If the women organizations are not present, if the grassroots groups are not present, then we will not be present. And so we have to make sure that we are all existing as feminist group and as women organization. And that's the most important thing, that we believe that other civil society, even international and global civil society, must be aware of, that our existence is conditioned by the existence of each other's. Organizations cannot exist on their own without the others.
It's such an incredible story of, working together to support your community, to support, progress towards the change that is needed, but also just to support, women and organizations that need survival at this stage.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always ask the question, just imagine the world without women organization. Imagine it, how cold and miserable it will be. We have been in existence, history of the women movement, for how long?
Yeah, women's movements are so incredibly powerful around the world, and for what we've seen at the Global Center, especially in atrocity situations. What are the biggest obstacles faced in trying to document violations and building credible cases for accountability in Sudan right now?
I mean, you would be surprised, but I'll tell you, it's resources, clearly resources. It's not culture, it's not tradition. Those are part of it. But the most significant barrier is resources. Can you believe it that until now, despite the fact that international community is talking about the suffering of women and girls, there is no structural support that's being provided for women and girls, serious structural support on the ground, minimal resources that's available for the women and girls. We are working with victims in hundreds who are really suffering and struggling to have access to mental health, to sexual and reproductive health support. Women victims are being crushed by stigma and shame, and many of them are unable to go back to their communities. So it's very painful, the lack of resources. And that has given us, a very painful feeling that, that, we're not, in terms of resources, there is no equality. That people, they think that it's okay, for African women and for women in our community to suffer what they as if it's normal. And That's something that's extremely painful. So this is what we are struggling with at the moment. We are really fighting for minimal resources, very difficult circumstances. We have to deal with responding to the crisis, trying to save lives, but at the same time, responding to a very tedious terms and condition to get small amounts of money that will help grassroots women groups to do what they were supposed to do. So you know, that's one of the most, as I said, painful part. I have been working on this field for more than 2 decades. I haven't seen times as harsh and as brutal as this. Not only the war in Sudan, which in itself is a huge tragedy, but basically the lack of empathy is quite painful, and we are seeing that, the lack of empathy with the conditions of women and girls, the normalization of violence. Yeah, so this would be, in my view, the most painful aspect.
Given this lack of support, this lack of, as you noted, lack of empathy, even lack of attention, I would say, on the international level to what's happening in Sudan now, how do you think international mechanisms could be more effective in providing protection to women and girls, to deterring abuses, to ensuring, accountability for what's happened there?
I think, first of all, people has to approach Sudan from an atrocity prevention framework. They have to understand that this is the campaign of atrocities that's happening, and it has to end, and the way to end it is by looking at at what the international community can do. What role does the international community can play on civilian protection? So we start with protecting civilians, and at the same time employ a comprehensive justice framework, which is, it looks at issues of accountability and justice at the international level, and at the same time putting enormous pressure and serious pressure on perpetrators and warring parties to respond to that. So that will be one thing to do it, but the investment on the civilian protection in itself is the form of justice. The investment on the human rights, on the women's rights, on the justice narrative, it's very important and critical for women, because they would understand and they would see that there is attention, and for the communities, they wouldn't feel abandoned, and it would reduce the scale of militarism and violence and people taking justice into their own hands. At this point in time, the women organizations are struggling to sustain the language of peace, the language of justice, and the narrative about the importance of peaceful coexistence because of the extreme polarization that has happened. And against it, there is no investment, on intercommunal peace. There is no investments on human rights awareness and things like that. So it's very, very important, if we want this violence to end, is to show that what we are trying to do on the ground, it has a value, to show that human rights matters, that the frontline women lawyers and other and men lawyers who are trying to support women who are criminalized and sent to jail, just for living on other parties' territories, or or for any reason, they scale of criminalization of women is significantly increasing, or because of their ethnic identity. It's really, it matters, it matters, for the international actors to address the massive number of women who are enforced disappeared in Darfur and getting killed and raped, and to talk about that. It matters to make people feel that at least there is acknowledgement of their pain. But when there is nothing literally, and we are against a very, how do you call it, called narratives that keep talking about political compromises, it sent a clear message that, well, this is, this issue then has to be, everyone has to resort to violence, and militarization increase, and violence increase, and so on.
I really appreciate how you've highlighted the different dimensions of what is happening and also what's missing. The missing atrocity prevention lens, the missing emphasis on human rights and intercommunal dynamics, which obviously will impact not just the violence now, but the kind of long-term trajectory of Sudan's future. But it also, there's so much nuance to what you've been talking about in terms of how women and girls have been uniquely targeted in this crisis. Often, especially in international spaces, policymaking spaces, everything gets distilled down to focusing just on sexual violence, which obviously is a grave problem. But you've just highlighted different ways in which women are being targeted through detention, through disappearance, that often isn't talked about in crises like these.
No, absolutely. This war, this violence, atrocities that are happening in Sudan, it's, women bodies are used as a tool in this war, in different ways, Forced disappearance has been quite prevalent. There is hundreds of women that nobody knows where are they. My organization alone has documented close to 300 cases of women who were enforced disappeared. Nobody knows anything about them. And when women disappeared in our societies, nobody, they would rather, just claim that they are dead. There is no acknowledgement, or they don't want to talk about it. Families and communities, they feel so ashamed, because they feel that they abandoned their responsibility and they couldn't protect the women and girls. So they end up kind of vanishing completely, and there is huge silence around them. The trafficking of women across borders, the sexual slavery. After the RSF was driven out of Khartoum, we have found it at least more than 100 women, who were detained in private locations, somewhere in farmhouses by the rivers, others inside remote homes, and those were sexual slavery hotspots. And women and girls have been experiencing sexual violence for months. And we were told by some of the survivors that many has lost their lives, and some has taken their own lives, and some has had children. And right now we have about 54 women that they don't want to go back, and this is all, it's enormous suffering. They don't want to go back to their community because they feel so ashamed. They feel so ashamed, and their communities are so traumatized. We have worked with mothers, who were trying to help their daughters. One of the girls killed herself She doesn't want the rest of her daughters also to commit suicide. Imagine a mother and three of her daughters were all gang raped. And that did not happen to one or two. That happened to hundreds and hundreds of Sudanese women across the country. Across the country. The scale of brutality was massive. And right now, women who stayed in RSF territories, they were accused of being collaborators, especially poor women. So they were detained, and charged with treason and sentenced to death. So you have the women prisons all of a sudden packed with women and children, you know, and they were accused of being traitors. And, and many of them are waiting for to be killed, for the sentencing. And it's so that's another issue. Sexual exploitation is quite rampant. Women, because they are not part of the decision making to access aid and relief, and they don't have information. And this is something we have been talking about for a long time, but it's as if we are, speaking into deaf ears, that women has to be part of decision making when it comes to humanitarian aid. They have to have information about it, and they need to know, and they need to have the decision and leadership on this. And but that is not happening. Little girls are exploited, sexual assaulted just to access food across the country, literally an act that was normalized. And let alone the other forms of violence that women are experiencing. So it's quite horrendous what Sudanese women are currently going through. To be honest with you, there is even in areas where education and schools were open, there is large numbers of girls who are not willing to go back to school because they are traumatized, because they are too afraid to leave the house. I have my own cousins, their daughters, they couldn't leave. Those are average Sudanese people who are, working class, and they just couldn't leave. They kept telling me, where would we go? So their childrens, who were 10 and 11 years old, for a whole year, they were sleeping underneath the bed, underneath beds because they were too afraid. They were too afraid. And it was very difficult for us as well because every day we were thinking what would happen to them if they are going to be raped, if they are going to be abducted. I have relatives who had to hide their daughters, cover them with hay. They are in the villages in south of Al Jazeera, when the RSF vehicles pass because they could easily take them. The trauma that has happened, and is still happening to the women, it requires significant investment because it's also affecting communities. And this is what people they don't realize. I have seen that in South Sudan. I have seen that in Somalia. The sexual violence doesn't happen to women alone. It happened to women within communities. And unless it was confronted heads on, it will continue to be inherited from one generation to the other. The violence will be inherited from one generation to the other.
That's just extremely difficult to deal with on an individual level, and as you said, on a community level, knowing what's happening and knowing the long-term impacts that it will have on the women and girls who have faced this. I want to turn back to how we started the conversation talking about WPS, and you gave tribute to the women who led the WPS movement and led to its creation, and to how much WPS has made a difference globally over the last 25 years. But I think the stories you've told, especially about what women's organizations are facing, show that it's not truly a success story yet. There's still a great distance we need to go. So if you could set priorities for the future, what would you insist that the international community and national governments do differently to, ensure that women are getting their voice heard, are, being fed the information they need to hear from decision makers, and actually get what they need in crises like what's happening in Sudan?
I think we have to be very serious about, and there should be accountability when it comes to matters related to gender equality within societies. I don't think that should be an issue of compromise. And I think in my part of the world, the humanity and the equality of women has been a matter of compromise for a very long time. And there have not been any serious accountability measures in this regard. Politicians, patriarchal institutions in control, they were never held accountable for that. So that's one thing that's really very very important. And we remain strongly believing on that. If there is no mechanisms that would hold, the dehumanization and the violence against women, seriously, start from the bilateral and multilateral institutions, all the way to grassroots groups. We have to be serious. To humanitarian agencies, they need to show, everyone has to show serious, commitments and evidence that they are committed to equality, they are committed to the WBS agenda, and that's not a place of compromise. That is not happening now. We could, everyone think that they could manipulate the women rights. Everyone think that they could, just by saying a few words, manipulate women peace and security agenda, and it's just tiring. It makes you tired that they think that with a few words you should be happy with them. For what? Yeah. Humanitarian international organizations, they are not even close, to that. And there is no accountability. We have to have accountability. Even local civil society, they have to be held accountable. And of course, policymakers and top government, at the top government levels, state actors and non-state actors, we shouldn't have anyone excluded, from the accountability of, when it comes to the dehumanization and the violation that's systematically committed against women. So that's something that I feel the WBS agenda has not, sufficiently addressed. Not sufficiently. I think we kind of settled in, to the very basics, and that is not acceptable, and it's not enough at all. Yes, we have the narrative, we have some mechanisms, but it's not working. It's not working because there is no accountability. That's very, very important, and accountability in participation. And participation, it doesn't mean presence. Participation in itself, if it's not being bound by accountability, it's meaningless. If it's not, a legitimate participation, if it doesn't have mechanisms to hold us accountable to those that we are representing, it's not enough that we are seated in certain positions. And so what? You know, who's holding us accountable? So this is that's one of the, I think, in my view, one of the biggest gaps of the WBS framework. The issues of accountability and legitimacy. And while representation is critical, but representation without legitimacy and without accountability and without engagements, serious engagements, it's proven that it doesn't take us anywhere.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and we'd be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.globalr2p.org and connect with us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn at GCR2P.